Cecil, there you go. 39 years ago this week, the Blues Brothers.
Yeah, Aretha's great, but my favorite scene is when they get the Roadhouse gig and ask the owners what kind of music they feature, and they we have both kinds, country and western.
And they had to have that chicken wire up in that place because
chicken wire up, played Rawhide.
Yeah, about 20 straight times probably because the boys were throwing the bottles at that chicken.
Stand by your man. They had to stand by your man too.
And they bailed on that bar tab, Cecil. You know?
They did. They had to get out of that place.
That led to hijinks. Hijinks ensued after that, Cecil. And really throughout that film 39 years ago this week. Hey, Cecil, we wanted to have you on, as we usually do on Tuesdays, to hit on a number of topics with you. And I got to start with this NCAA sort of statement on what could be coming for some of these basketball programs, high-level basketball programs that have been implicated or outright mentioned or outright showed up on wiretaps in the FBI investigation into the sport, about forthcoming notices of allegations for a half dozen or so schools. Were you surprised? Was this different from the NCAA to kind of put this out there like that?
I was. I don't know how much of it was, quote, the NCAA as an institution. It's certainly a high rank. I'm not downplaying that it's a high-ranking NCAA official, but it's really not. Stan's not really in the enforcement office. And I would say two things, and these are true generally. Say less than you know is a good rule of thumb, and always under promise. And if I could add a third, if you under promise and over deliver, everybody's happy. If you over promise and under deliver, then you've got problems. And I would add a third thing in that kind of speculation. Never put a number or a date. Never say 16, because that just drives everybody into a frenzy of trying to guess which 16. And you may end up with 5, and you may end up with 7 or 8. So I was a little bit surprised. I don't necessarily think that it was an official statement that was vetted up through the channels and the NCAA wanted to put out there. With that said, it's certainly interesting. It's certainly newsworthy that anybody, at the vice presidential level in the NCAA would say such a thing. And I think that the NCAA as a group, and again, you're talking about a lot of individuals who make up a group, but as a group, they have a tendency to be thin-skinned about things sometimes, and they hear, "Oh, you're not doing anything. Oh, you're just going to give these people a pass." And I think they got in. I think they got in all kinds of a bad situation with Penn State football, primarily for that reason, because certain media outlets were on the warpath about what are you going to do about Penn State football, which situation was heinous. It was a criminal situation, but it wasn't an NCAA enforcement situation. So, I've always believed that. And they ended up having to walk back a lot of, the big measures that they tried to apply. Certainly hurt Penn State's process, but I don't know that the way in which they hurt Penn State did anything to resolve what the actual problems at Penn State were.
Yeah, my initial reaction to this, and I believe it came from Dennis Dodd, a report from him at CBSSports.com, was that maybe the governing body was suffering from a little bit of a case of rabbit ears, as you just outlined, because I've said it here on this show. We've talked about it. You've outlined a scenario of potentially, will the NCAA and other governing bodies just try to kick the can, so to speak, down the road until perhaps this blows over? And that's the feeling I got when I initially saw the report, was that this is a way, whether it was authorized or not, and by the way, if it wasn't, I'm guessing somebody got a good talking to there at the home office, to let not only member institutions know, but also the media. As you said, the Penn State situation is a great analogy there, that we still have everything under control, guys. That's almost the feeling I got there.
Yeah, it was almost like a campaign, one of those tough on crime campaign speeches. Well, those are good if you're running for governor, but they're not necessarily great if you're the prosecutor. And the prosecutor might not want the governor or the candidate for governor coming out, particularly the sitting governor, coming out with, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. They're much more, let's let this process play out, which I am also. We'll see how the process plays out. They promised, or people certainly read that as a promise. So now let's see if they deliver or if they underdeliver, or over-deliver for that matter.
With that analogy, Cecil, you're giving me a Pappy O'Daniel, "Oh brother, where art thou?" flashback. And making that reference. Cecil, let me ask you this.
I'm a forgive and forget Christian.
We got to get us some of that refoam, Pappy. Let me ask you this in connection with all this. There seems to be more talk about Arizona and maybe Kansas as one of the six, or one of the few, at least, most prominent programs. I haven't seen as much about LSU, though. And I continue to get the sense from people who are close to that program, cover that program, that the expectation has almost become that LSU may not be involved in all this.
I get different opinions about that, so we'll see. I'm not going to speculate. But as I said, I don't know that it's really productive that the number 6 was thrown out there and that people are guessing the 6. But I'd think if that's the case, there would be a chance of an SEC institution or two being involved in the 6. And nobody knows for sure, but I think that particularly the most recent trial is in the forefront, in which Arizona was mentioned a lot. The Christian Dawkins trial, in which Arizona was mentioned a lot, Kansas was mentioned to some extent, and LSU was mentioned too. USC has had a coach convicted. Chuck Person has pled guilty at Auburn, so I think that you can. The scenario that seemed to be being sold was now all these legal proceedings have wrapped up, and we being the NCAA can move forward. But again, I'm not going to speculate. I don't know if there are 6. I don't know if LSU's one of the 6. You hear a lot of names bandied about, but I would think if you go back and review that trial, that you can get some sense of, and the verdicts in some of the cases that didn't go to trial because somebody took a plea. I think you can at least do some educated guesswork. But can I sit here and say, this school's going to get it or that school's going to get it? No, I can't. I don't know what their thought process is.
I guess at this point, though, if you're an LSU supporter or even someone that covers that program, you have some reason to think that maybe you're going to come out the other side of this okay, although the light at the end of that tunnel may very well be the NCAA freight train. We'll have to wait and see. Hey, Cecil, let's talk about the recently completed sports year at the University of Alabama. I know you wrote about this a couple of days ago, but just in terms of an overall evaluation, I got the sense that you felt like it was an okay year. Certainly from football, where it all starts for Alabama. You win an SEC championship, you come up short in a national championship game, but you still win 14 games. So I don't know how you can label that as anything but a success. But department-wide, there's programs that obviously don't get the attention, like, let's say, track and field. had a really good indoor and outdoor season. There's variables that come into play. Just look at the men's and women's golf teams and how they were hit by early departures. How did you sort of weigh all that, Cecil, in coming up with your evaluation of this sports year at Alabama?
Well, you do have to include expectations. For instance, football had what would be a great season at any other school on earth, to make the championship game. Here, particularly the way the game went, and when I say here in Tuscaloosa, the reaction, because Nick Saban has created such expectations, are that this wasn't a vintage year. That this was okay. They won the conference. That's amazing to me. That people don't necessarily, and I'm not saying all people, but there are people who don't give full credit for how difficult it is to win the Southeastern Conference. When you compare to how excited 11 or 12 of the programs in the conference would be if they could ever get just an SEC title. Over the past decade, at least, it's basically been Alabama, Georgia, and then Auburn has done it as well. But it's been a long time since anybody else did it. So you calibrate a little bit with that. I think football had a great year and a bad last game. But in terms of a year, I think they had a great year. Expectations are high for golf. I understand the circumstances that both Jay Sewell and Nick Potter had to deal with this year. They kind of, they made the NCAA field. They didn't get out of a regional. That's not what the expectations for their programs are. But I think you can really, particularly when you start talking about two or three players, your two or three best players on a 5-member team, either being injured or turning pro, it was over half your roster. And it would be interesting to think, just randomly in men's golf, there was clearly after talking about Alabama football, there was clearly a dominant team in Oklahoma State. They didn't win the match play. So great year, okay year. Clearly the best team, loaded with great players. But that match play will get you sometimes. And it got, like Alabama's women the year before, clearly the best team didn't win the match final. So you allow for those expectations. I think softball helped a lot. I think they exceeded, even though expectations are high. I think getting to Oklahoma City, the run they had in Oklahoma City, where they beat Florida, where they beat Oklahoma one game and pushed that to nearly make the championship. We didn't get to see them measure themselves against UCLA, which was clearly the best team. But that's a Final Four. I mean, that's like a Final Four. It's tie for third in the record books, and I think you can make a pretty strong argument that Alabama was third. So that was a good year. And some other programs did well. Rowing had a great year. It's just, rowing doesn't get much publicity. People say, oh, but fair is fair. They had a great year. And some other programs didn't. Gymnastics didn't make the Super Six or the version of the Super Six in the new format, and that's probably a disappointment. So there were good things if you want to look for them. Basketball was in transition. Baseball is certainly in a rebuild, not just in transition, but certainly in rebuilding. So I think men's basketball was a bit of a disappointment just because it was kind of right there for them to get in the field, and they didn't do it. I think women's basketball, I think probably they need to look at making the field next season. I think they do.
They've got a tournament backcourt, Cecil. Yeah, with Jordan Lewis and Sierra Johnson. If they don't make it next year, I don't know when. They're 20 years without an NCAA tournament appearance at this point.
And it's not like you've got to win. I'm not saying I got to win the SEC.
No.
If you finish 6th or 7th.
Yeah. Go 9-9 in the league. and you're going to make the NCAA tournament.
I think those expectations are fair for next year. So I wouldn't say this was a vintage year because there were no championships, and this is a program that's built, rightly so, on winning championships, conference championships and national championships. But I don't think it was an out-and-out disaster when you look at the teams that did win conference championships in football and softball and the national performances from track and swimming. So I think if anything, it sort of whets the appetite for the 2019-2020 year.
And we talk about baseball because we have an ongoing College World Series right now out in Omaha. What's a realistic expectation in year 3, you think, for Brad Bohannon? Because, I mean, for what he took over and what he is trying to compete within, just his division in the SEC West, if you paid even just a little attention to this postseason, you see what Brad Bohannon's up against. What do you think for 2020 for the baseball team?
Again, I think making it to Hoover would be realistic. I'm interested to see a little bit, tiny things affect other things. How Missouri's appeal works out if they end up having to take them, if they haven't been ruled on yet. And so they were eligible for Hoover this year because their appeal was pending. They may have to take that hit next year. Just depends on what the appeals committee rules. So I think making Hoover's realistic. On the one hand, the record was probably not even what Brad Bohannon wanted. On the other hand, you look at Auburn playing in Omaha, and Alabama split 4 games with Auburn this year. Mm-hmm. So is it that far off? It's certainly a long way away from the 2 teams playing tonight, Vanderbilt and Mississippi State. And I think it's going to take another year beyond this year. I thought they came out pretty well after the draft, but I'd still say right now it's that next step is just getting back to Hoover, getting in that top 12, and competing in postseason in that way, and then building towards the next postseason in the NCAA.
You mentioned tonight in Omaha, you got Vanderbilt and Mississippi State. Cecil, is this Vanderbilt's last gasp effort to make sure it gets a cut of that conference revenue pie here in the College World Series?
Well, they've won it before, so
yeah,
they've been strong in baseball. The amazing thing in some ways is having been good so many times, but probably not quite same storyline as Florida State, but it's not that far removed, is that Mississippi State hadn't won one yet. And
yeah.
So I tell you what, Michigan certainly exceeded my expectations on the other side of the bracket, but the team that wins tonight, they're going to be tough to knock out of that thing.
Cecil, as we wrap up with you here on Southern Fried Sports presented by Mercedes-Benz of Tuscaloosa, we heard from Nick Saban a couple weeks ago, sort of challenging Tua Tagovailoa to take care of his business, to do everything he possibly could to improve and make sure he's ready to go for the 2019 season. Sounds like in some comments that you were able to gather from Nick Saban in recent days, Tua is exactly on track to do that.
Looks like he is. They also had a video. Jeff Allen released a video out with the campers, the kids, the young campers. But he looked a little bit leaner. He just physically looked a little bit. It's hard to tell today. They're wearing all the pads and so forth. But I think that Tua, it's all relative in the spring. But I think he really kind of came out of the spring and felt like he really needed to improve himself, get the ankle rehab, get in great shape and be ready for the upcoming season. And I think he's done that. And I think he did it last year. I think he had missed spring and had to do it. And I think he did it last year and has done it again this year. So, you don't want to make too much out of it. Although it would certainly be big news if I lost 15 pounds. But for an athlete, you don't want to make too much out of it. But again, there's a lot riding on Tua for this season, so people are interested in every little detail.
Yeah, not only from a team perspective, but for Tua and his family potentially, and what could come secondarily, obviously, from the 2020 NFL draft.
I don't know, even in his defense, and I don't know that he needs to be defended, but I do think that Tua's focus is on this season and not on next April.
Sure. Hey, Cecil, as we wrap up with you, the question of the day: lemon or lime? Which one do you prefer, and what do you like your preference in the most of those two?
I've always been a lime person. For a variety of reasons. I like it just in ice water, squeeze a couple in there, or ice. I prefer it to lemon and tea if you can get it. If you're at a restaurant with a bar, you can usually get a lime in there. On fish, on Thai food, I'm definitely a lime person.
We'll put you down. We got Cecil Hurt down as Lime Guy here on a Tuesday edition of Southern Fried Sports. Cecil, as always, we appreciate it, my man. Keep up the great work. We know you will. If you haven't followed Cecil already on Twitter, you have. But if you haven't, at Cecil Hurt on Twitter. And we look forward to talking again real soon, Cecil.
Okay, Travis. Talk to you soon.